Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health, Supra Omnia. Mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Women are more likely to initiate divorce. Despite the rise of dual income couples, they end up with a greater loss of income and at the same time end up with even more responsibility for childcare. Their journey through this difficult and very emotional process is the subject of our talk today. To fully explore this issue, we brought in Oona Metz, LCSW. With over 30 years of experience working with individuals, families, and groups, Oona has used her expertise and experience to write the book, Unhitched, The Essential Guide for Women. I read it. It's a great book. It provides very useful tools to use along the way. And if I can, I would also say that it's compassionate and understanding at the same time. Oona, based on your experience, why are women more likely to initiate divorce? And when reflecting on your work with women, was there anything that you found unexpected or surprising?
Great question. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. I've really been looking forward to our conversation. And just as a little point of background, for the last 15 years, I have been running divorce support groups in my practice outside of Boston for women. And so I have literally seen hundreds of women through the process of divorce.
Mhm.
So the research is pretty clear out there about the difference in marriage for men and for women. I think there's a great Harvard study that looks at how beneficial marriage is for men, both in the areas of finance and health and mental health. And I think for women, there can be benefits if it's a healthy marriage, but there's also a tremendous amount of emotional and physical labor that is put onto women when they get married. There's one study that shows when a man and woman get married, the woman's household labor goes up by 7 hours a week, and men's goes down by 1 hour a week. And actually, women, when they get divorced, end up sleeping more than they did when they were married. Um, so I think we still, even here in 2026, there's still some inequality in terms of parenting and household labor. And I think women tend to be more active in relationships, both in starting them, maintaining them, and also ending them. And I'll tell you what I have found in my practice is that I have seen many, many women who've been trying for years to make their marriage better, um, to improve their marriage, or to engage their spouse in doing that work. And their spouse has been either unwilling or incapable of doing that work. And so oftentimes she initiates a divorce, and the marriage is really already over in many ways. So they both have left the kind of spoken and unspoken vows of the marriage, and yet she's kind of bears the brunt of doing the work to initiate the divorce. Um, so
Interesting.
that's what I've seen. Yeah, yeah.
Let's bring in Erika Kawamura. Erika is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Equilibria Psychological. She has a Doctor of Psychology, PsyD, years of experience, also board certified in lifestyle medicine. Erika, in your experience, do men and women enter marriage with unrealistic expectations to begin with?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I hate to use the word it depends, but I think there's no hard and fast rule, right? In like certain cases, I think if it's those situations where the little nuances, the little annoyances end up snowballing and become that source of frustration, oftentimes, they might go in thinking like, oh, but it'll be different once we get married. He'll change once we get married. He or she will change after we have the kids. Um, but sometimes, and obviously we know that that may or may not be the case, or like they kind of know what they're getting into, but they just kind of look the other way. And other times, like they really are truly in love, and it's just somehow life or getting older, whatever, they drift apart, or like one or both partners feel like the other one changed. Like, they're not as fun, or they're not as, bubbly, or, they want to stay home all the time and the other one wants to go out. And I think it just depends.
It's kind of interesting. In preparation for today, I actually talked to a couple of people that have gone through divorce. And I actually heard what you just said, Erika, where, prior to marriage, it was like, oh, you want to go camping? Sure. I love camping. Even though they'd never gone camping, men or women, by the way. So, or whatever else it may be. And it's like, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then once they get married, it's like, I don't have to do that anymore. So it actually bears exactly what you said.
Or adulting happens, right? Adulting happens, and like, the statistics.
Right. It's very different, I think, to be married in your 20s when you're both working a job, but you're renting an apartment, and that you don't have many responsibilities. That's very different than years later, where you own a house and you have kids, and there's so much more kind of work involved and decision making involved in that stage of life.
Right.
So, and when you were saying, Dan, like, do people have realistic expectations? I think everybody who gets married, for the most part, 99% of the people who get married think they're getting married forever, and half of them will not be married forever, right? So I think there is an unrealistic expectation that this is going to last forever. And
that's actually another way to look at it.
Sometimes it does, and sometimes it does not. Oftentimes it does not. So yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book on my little Kindle here, I read your divorce grief model, and I found that kind of interesting. Can you walk us through? First of all, you walk us through the stages of going through this process, and then the stages of grief. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. When I was writing Unhitched, I got to a part of the book where I thought, I think it would be very helpful to have a map for people to follow, because I know in the beginning of divorce and oftentimes in the middle, it just feels awful, right? I mean, it's heartbreaking, it's stressful, it's chaotic, and people have, it's a very difficult process to go through. But I also know from working with so many women in my practice that it does get better. And so I wanted to offer people kind of a roadmap to show them that they're not going to just get stuck kind of in the muck of it, but there will be a place to kind of come out. So that's how I developed this 5-stage model. And I think the first stage is always heartbreak. And it's heartbreak whether you're the person who initiates divorce or not. Because even if you're the person who initiates divorce, you're only going to initiate it after many, many, many heartbreaks in your marriage, right? So sometimes people think, well, if you initiated it, you must be happy, or you must, it must be fine for you. But I don't think that's true. I think people are heartbroken to have to make that decision. So that's always the first stage, the heartbreak stage. And certainly if somebody else is initiating your divorce, it's heartbreaking as well.
Right. Or like if an external situation had caused it, such as or I shouldn't say cause, greatly contributed to it, such as an affair, or, those deal breaker situations.
It's so people are in this stage, this heartbreak stage, right?
Yeah.
Some people you mentioned in your book, maybe half, have a lot of external friends. They have a lot of they're very social, and they many times are open about the fact that they're going through a divorce or having difficulty in their marriage. But then you mentioned there's many people as well that are very private and don't want to say anything to anybody. You also talk about the reactions that others have. What's the right reaction if if we're friends? I didn't know you were you were going through such difficulty. You're going to have a divorce. What you finally tell me, for whatever reason, what's the right response? And let me just tell you, the last person that told me they were going through the divorce, I said, honest to God, this is true. I said, you got to help me out here. Am I happy for you or am I sad for you? Tell me
Perfect.
what I should be doing.
Perfect. That is the perfect response. I'm so glad that you said that. I just actually wrote an article that was called Congratulations or Condolences: What to Say to
Right?
Your
Yeah.
Friend Who's Getting
I just read
Divorced.
that.
Yes. So, because I think it's true I think in the beginning stages for most people, it's very, very sad. But by the end, for some people, it's still sad. And for some people, it's a level of freedom. It's an accomplishment. It's something to be proud of that they got through. So I think really the best advice is not to assume that you know, unless you're very, obviously, if you're very, very close to the person and you've heard all the details all along, then you know what the right response is. But I think divorce is also nuanced. It's often not one or the other. It's a very nuanced thing. And so even if somebody, like we were saying before, if somebody wants to get divorced, that doesn't mean they're happy about it necessarily. They may feel like an extra level of freedom, or that it was the right thing, and they may still feel some level of sadness or regret, or pain or uncertainty too. So, it's all the feelings, I
Yeah,
think.
like especially if there was that long, what you were describing earlier of trying to
Yeah,
trying to engage the other person to work on their issues. And, if the other partner doesn't see it as a problem, what's there to work on? And
right, right,
it's that
right.
whole battle. So, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
totally agree.
yeah.
Something that you mentioned, Erika, also prompted something in my head. You mentioned well, something about age in your very first response, and as I have done the research, it looks like there's just a rapid increase, if you will, in graying divorce, if you will.
Yes.
I can say that even though I used to have jet black hair, I have gray hair now, but hopefully that's not going to happen for me. Why is there an increase in graying divorce, and is it easier or harder for women at that point in time?
Mm-hmm. So, the first very basic reason is that people are living longer. They're living longer lives. And I think in the old days, if you got to 60 and you've been married for 35 years, you figure, well, we only have a few years left. We might as well stick it out, right? But I think
Right.
these days, if you get to 60, you think to yourself, geez, I got another maybe 25, 30 years with this person. I don't know if I can
Right.
do that, right? I want to have a different kind of chapter next. I think also women have made great gains financially. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where a woman couldn't have her own mortgage or couldn't have her own credit card. And these days, I think women are much more financially independent. So they're not staying because of financial dependence, right? I think the other factor is a lot of times the divorce, I'm seeing this a tremendous amount. The divorce coincides with kids going off to college or kids leaving the house to get a job. And, parents might be pretty aligned in terms of parenting, or at least even if they're not aligned, they're kind of head down, we got to get through this time. It's, parents are incredibly busy these days and sometimes don't have much time for themselves, for their own relationship with their partner or spouse. And when the kids finally leave the house, they might look at each other and think,
Who are you?
we don't have anything in
Yeah.
common anymore, now that we're not, sitting on the sidelines watching our kid play soccer, or, going to those violin recitals, we don't there's not much in common anymore. And so I think that's part of the reason, the rise in people getting divorced who are over 65 has tripled in the last couple of decades. And over 50, it's doubled. So it is a big, that's the proportion of people where the divorce rate is really going up.
And
And
I
something
think
like,
you mentioned, oh, please go ahead. Eric, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to comment with the longevity stuff. And it is interesting, because I know a lot of, especially now with the way people are living, maybe it's just my perception is like when you're a kid versus, close. It's back in the day, like people who were 60s, they were like grandmom, they acted like grandmom and all of grandpas, all of that. But now, like I see people in their 60s, even 70s, and they're like traveling around the world. They've got a vibrant life and everything. And so and then there's also 60-year-olds who are really not healthy, or even 40-year-olds who aren't healthy. So I can see it if it was like that dynamic where if one partner is very active in life and has so many retirement plans and everything, and the other person is more like, unwell or just not motivated to do things, more of a homebody. I can see that being a source of tension as well.
Yeah.
There's correct me if I'm wrong, Oona, but there's a rise of infidelity as well, as one gets older.
Yes, which I thought was really surprising. I would have figured that it would be people in their 30s and 40s who are having the most infidelity, but for women, it's 50s and 60s is the highest proportion. And for men, it's men in their 70s
How
are
does that
having
work? Like, what do
the
you think that
most
is?
affairs. Yeah,
Why do you
yeah.
think that is?
Um, I think for men, it may be that as they're leaving the workforce, they are wanting to feel important or valued still, and they may look to an outside relationship as a way to kind of feel powerful or valuable or attractive as they're kind of winding down their careers. I don't know. I mean, I haven't, I haven't talked to lots of men about why they're having affairs, but that's just something I wonder about. I wonder what you guys think about that theory.
That's a good point. Yeah, because like the statistics with the women that you quote that you mentioned, like that I can understand, right? Because it kind of coincides with that graying divorce and coincides with a lot of that resentment and exhaustion from the day to day. But I just thought I was curious about the 70 plus.
Yeah.
What you said rings true for me. It would be, in a traditional environment, people are retiring. They're retiring at 60. They're retiring at 65. Maybe they're going a little longer, going, 70. So it would ring true. I don't have my life was my work, even though many people would not say that. It's true. That's where they spend all of their time. And so I don't have that affirmation from work anymore. So
Right.
I could see where that would make sense. That would be not a reason, but
Yeah.
that would be
factor.
part of the whole process,
Yeah.
a factor.
Yep.
Be
By
more
the same
vulnerable.
token, yes, but by the same token, I mean, at that point in time, it's like, you got to be kidding me. Come on.
Right. Do you want me to tell you? I only have one divorce joke, but it's related. Do you want me to tell you my one divorce
Please.
joke?
Yes,
Please.
please.
So, an elderly couple, he's 95 and she's 93, go into the judge and they say, Judge, we'd like a divorce. We've been married for 75 years but we want to get divorced now. And the judge is looking kind of gobsmacked and he says, well, I mean, I'm willing to grant you a divorce, but I really need to ask you, like, you don't have many years left. Like, why now? You've been married for 75 years. Why would you do that now? And they said, well, we were waiting for the children to die.
There you go.
Yeah.
I could see that. I could see that. Why would there be a rise of infidelity for women in their 50s and 60s at that point in time? Is it there? What do you
Great
hear?
question. Yeah. I think a lot of women have pretty high levels of emotional connection need. And I think for women in their 50s and 60s, you often see more emotional affairs or the kind of affairs that begin emotionally and become sexual, but they're looking for that emotional connection that they may not be getting in their marriage.
I see.
So
Okay.
I think after years and years and years of trying to get it in their marriage, oftentimes they may go elsewhere to get it, and then that develops into more of a sexual affair.
Mhm.
But again, this is anecdotal from my
Right.
practice,
Mhm.
so.
Mhm.
You,
Well, that
you give
reminded me
an,
of, go ahead.
no, all right, good.
I was gonna say that reminded me of a question I had where, like, like through your work and everything, are there like any subtle signs perhaps that maybe can kind of like go ignored, leading up to it until next thing you know, it does snowball into a big thing that, leads into a couple likely to get divorced into that direction or, yeah.
Um, I think definitely a lack of communication. Um, I don't think it's necessarily about a lack of shared hobbies. I think people can
Mhm.
have different hobbies or different interests, but as long as they're able to communicate and as long as they're able to resolve differences, I think the old research on couples therapy said that couples who had different interests or had differences were more in trouble. And I think now
Mhm.
we know that couples who have differences are okay as long as they're able to resolve those differences. So, being able to fight well, or resolve things well, I think is an important indicator of a healthier marriage. Um, and for the couples who kind of can't, like, I think one of the warning signs of a marriage is in trouble is when a couple stops fighting, right? If they
Right. I guess,
stop
right. They've given up.
having arguments because they've given
Mhm.
up. I mean, it's one thing if they've stopped fighting because they're getting along great, but if they're harboring resentments against
Yes.
each other
Mhm.
and they're not speaking those out loud, they're just shoving them under the rug. At some point, the rug is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until
Mhm.
the whole thing blows. So, I get worried when I see couples who are really angry at each other, but they've decided there's no use in talking about it.
Right. So what's the point? It
She's
doesn't
she's
end
not going
well.
to change, or
Right.
he's
Or
not
he's
going to
not going to
change. It's just not
listen.
going to. Yep. I've given up.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I'm
which
glad you
is
brought up the
which is
resentment.
different than acceptance. I think there's
Yes.
acceptance of,
Mhm.
okay, this is something that she always does. It kind of drives me crazy, but you know what? The rest of our life is good, so I'm just going to accept that. That's really different than, this drives me absolutely crazy. But every time I bring it up, we get into a fight. So I'm not going to bring it up, but I am going to hold on to it. I'm going to hold this grudge.
Right.
Those
That
two things are
resentment.
very, very different and lead to very different outcomes, I think.
Mhm.
We've mentioned children a couple times at this point in time, and in your book, you provide um, some excellent suggestions for how to tell younger children.
Yeah.
And you may want to talk a little bit about that, but I'm more interested, quite frankly, in older children because you have
Hmm.
older children, they're adults, they may be married themselves, they certainly have dated, those types of things. So, is that same format used for older children? Do I have to worry about older children? Can I just say, hey, your mom and I don't get along anymore, or whatever the case is? Can I, just say have some flip comment and get divorced? What about that? What about the older children?
Um, Kids are kids are kids, I would
Mhm.
say.
Yes.
So I think you need to consider the developmental stage that your child is in, whether they're 8 months old or 8 years old or 28 years old. And I think,
Mhm.
there's plenty of great books and resources about how to tell your younger kids or how to deal with kids in a divorce that are in your care still. But I think divorce impacts adult children as well. And I think it's really important to be really sensitive to that and to focus, if you're, in a gray divorce and you have adult children, to focus on the child part, not the adult part of your adult children, because you're still their
Mhm.
parent and they're going to be impacted too. even if they don't have to, deal with going back and forth between two houses, they're still going to be impacted by your
Mhm.
divorce. So I think it's really important to take into consideration what's the developmental stage that your child is in.
Interesting. Interesting. I was talking to someone. Uh, they believe they handled the talk with the children appropriately, but and obviously she wasn't um, brutally honest about why they got divorced.
Yep.
But she's desperate to
Good.
tell them, and she's waiting for them to get older so that she could just like unburden herself on why they got divorced. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Brutal honesty. Should I tell them once they're 30? What's the deal?
Um, I think if you are telling your child, if you're being brutally honest with your child about their co-parent who they depend on and love, and throwing that co-parent under the bus, that is not a
Mhm.
good idea. And I understand how hard it is if you feel like your co-parent is the reason for the divorce. It may feel like you don't want to share the blame, or
Mm-hmm.
give your child the talk of like, we've decided, but it is really in the best interest of your child to not know the nitty-gritty details of adult relationships, especially their parents' relationships, and especially if it means that then they are placed in a loyalty bind.
Mhm.
If they know that you're getting divorced because one of their parents did XYZ, that puts them in a really difficult position in terms of their relationship with that parent. So, and it can often backfire. I've seen cases where sometimes one parent will kind of tell the kids about the other parent's bad behaviors, and it ends up backfiring, and the kids end up siding with the parent who, you know, did the bad behavior, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's important to be really thoughtful. I also say, like, it's so important in those early stages of divorce when your central nervous system is kind of on fire and you're not making the best decisions. Like, really, you can always tell something, but you can never untell it, right? So it's kind of like
Yeah.
how we talk to kids about putting things on the internet. Like, as soon as you put something on the internet, it is there
Yeah.
forever. And same thing, if the second you're getting divorced, if you start telling everybody the reasons why, you have to understand that that's going to be out there forever. You
Mhm.
can
Right.
always make the decision to tell in the future, but you can't ever go and rewind that tape, We don't have
Mhm.
cassette tapes anymore that you can rewind. We have the internet and it lasts forever. And telling people things lasts forever. So I really encourage people to be careful especially in those beginning stages.
Mhm. So let's get back
It's
to
kind of
you started talking about the grief. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I
no,
keep
no, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
the grief stages. So you
Oh,
talked about
yes.
heartbreak,
Yes, yes.
and
We
then the
got the
early stages. So
heartbreak.
yes, we got the
Yep.
heartbreak down, and
Yes,
we got a
yes.
lot of nitty-gritty things
Yep.
out of that.
Yep. And
Um,
then the second stage, I think, is the roller coaster. And I think that's the roller coaster of feelings where people are feeling so much. They're feeling sad and mad and worried and ashamed, perhaps, but also maybe some relief or some joy. And the feelings, sometimes they're really expected and sometimes they're totally unexpected, but it is a time where people feel so much. And so I wanted to include this to also let people know that this stage does not last forever. I think it is oftentimes the longest stage. And even when you're moving on to further stages down the road, you can return to this stage
mhm.
at times. But yeah, roller coaster is the second.
What would be the best advice? Because, I see that this, just this is the place where a lot of people struggle with. And typically, if there is a lot of anger and resentment built up for that person, it's really
Mhm.
hard to work through that,
Yes.
So
This
how
is
do
a
you?
time where it's really important to engage a therapist, a
Mhm.
coach, a support group, really important to lean into any kind of self-care practices you have, writing in a journal, walking, exercising, um, and reaching out to people who support you and people who love you
Mhm.
and spending time with those people. So, yeah.
Why is it that men are more likely to remarry, um, women not? Why is that?
Well, I think it goes back to the thing we were talking about in the beginning is that marriage is really good for men. It really works for them. And, we were talking before about, when men and women get married, men's labor in the house goes down by an hour and the women's goes up by 7 hours. So why wouldn't you? I think men also in our society right now, women are really socialized and kind of wired to have a number of friends and have community, and men are less so wired in that way to have those kinds of emotional connections with other men. And so I think when men and women get divorced, you know, men often feel lonelier, because oftentimes their wife was their best friend. Whereas if you ask a woman
Oh,
who
sure.
her best friend is, she might say, well, my husband, but she's also going to say, and Sally and Sarah and Mary, those are my best friends. She has a community. And so I think we see men getting remarried at a much higher rate, whereas women sometimes are pretty content to stay
We've
single
talked
or to
about,
have friends or
well, we've
go
talked
ahead.
about men and women, but not all marriages are men and women. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're
Mhm.
uh, men and men, and sometimes they're women and women, and
Yep.
many variations in between. The statistics that you cite, where men marriage is good for men, their workload goes down, and lots of things get taken care of for them.
Yep.
Is that how does that work in a uh, a gay marriage or in a lesbian marriage in terms
Mhm.
of that workload, in terms of
Mhm.
are they less likely or more likely to remarry, or is, when I say they, any one particular partner, or
Mm.
how does that work? Is there a fundamental difference? I guess what I'm asking is
Mhm.
what are the
Right.
fundamental differences here?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Gay men have married gay men have the lowest divorce rates.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
they, yeah, yep. And I don't know about the remarriage rates for gay men. I'm not sure about that. I think women oftentimes partner up pretty quickly afterwards if they're in a same-sex couple. Um, they often do. In terms of sharing the workload, I think they're not, for gay men and for women who are in a same-sex relationship, they are not constrained by those kind of gender dynamics that are baked into our society. And so oftentimes you do see that um, there are different people take different roles in a same-sex marriage. Somebody might do more of the income, somebody might do more of the housework, but it's not baked in terms of gender. And so they tend to have worked it out more, and that it rather than it being kind of a default position,
Interesting.
it tends to be more an agreed upon or collaborative or worked out position of, okay, I'm going to do the cooking and you're going to do the cleaning, and I'm going to have more income and you're going to have less income, but you're going to take care of the kids, or, whatever the case may be.
It sounds
It's
like more
not so much a
communication.
default. More communication, more collaboration. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In your practice, obviously you've dealt with lots of women. We said in the very beginning that at the end of divorce, women tend to have uh, lower income, lower financial
Mm-hmm.
independence. But that's not
Yep.
always the case. In one of the cases where I was talking to people before this podcast, The woman was they both worked, but she made more money than her husband. They divorced. She still is making more money than her husband. Um, are there in that type of a divorce, are there the same emotional and other demands on the woman that breaks up? Does that financial independence help them get through divorce in a more complete way?
Well, I think we know that whether you're married or unmarried, that finances can play a big role in somebody's stress and mental health. And so, you know, I don't know where that line is of like if we know that if you don't have much money, you have more stress, right? Financial stress, in terms of paying for things and affording things and all of that stuff. And I think once you have there's a certain level at which if you have a lot of money, you have a lot of stress too about what to do with it. I feel a little bit less compassionate for those people. But anyway, just an aside there. So, but I do think that finances play a big role in divorce. Assets get split. Sometimes alimony comes into play. Child support comes into play. And so that, finances can be a reason that people stay in unhealthy marriages for much, a long, long time after the marriage has really run its course. I mean, one of my hot takes at this moment in time is that when the interest rates go down, we're going to see divorce rates go up because I think at this point in time, it's so expensive and difficult to afford to have two houses, right? For the family to, go into two separate dwellings. And so I think we will see divorce rates going up. I think there's a lot of people right now who are kind of white knuckling it through an unhealthy marriage because they can't afford to get out.
Fascinating.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
You've worked with a lot of women, obviously. Was there anything that was surprising in terms of the demographics? Are there some women that make it through this process easier? And if it is, why do they? Was there anything that's unusual or unexpected that you found?
Um, I think for women I think prior mental health really matters. So if you, before you get divorced, if you've really been struggling with your mental health, that sometimes that's because of something that's very historic and has been there for a really long time. And sometimes it's the product of being part of an unhealthy marriage. And so when women walk into my office, oftentimes they're feeling pretty terrible, right, about themselves and about their situation, and their mental health is suffering. And it's interesting to see over the course of time, is that something that's historic and, they're going to struggle with mental health once they get divorced as well? Or was that a product of an unhealthy marriage? And once they get divorced, they're they're flying, they're doing great. And most of the time that's what I see is that women seem happier and more empowered and stronger after they get divorced. But sometimes they continue to really struggle with their mental health. So that's one thing I've seen. I think another thing that's been surprising is just how the statistics are matching my practice. And the last number of referrals I've gotten in the last couple of years have been mostly women in their 60s, who've been married for 30 or 40 years. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yep. So, there's the statistics and the anecdotes, and that in this case, they're lining up.
And even with your the grief divorce model, I was like, yeah, that's so true. Just like with what I've seen, like in both, personal life, but also the, clinically and, professionally too, like it, wherever, like I've we meet up in that stage, whether it's like they're, oh, it was like many, many years ago versus like at some point or before or leading up to finally just deciding to leave, or they were able to turn it around. But yeah, it's also like very reflective. So yeah. So would you want to talk about the three? Oh, go ahead.
No, well, in your book, you talk about the reasons for divorce. Okay, and you mentioned abuse, and obviously abuse for either party is dangerous and inappropriate. You have to try and get out of those situations, obviously. But when you're dealing with just growing apart, we're not compatible. As opposed to infidelity or something along those lines. Is it, does it make it more difficult for women to divorce at that point in time because they just feel like they're not compatible? Do they just stay? Are there differences between those people and those and the ones that are subject to abuse, or those that are subject to infidelity? Is there any characteristics that are
definitely? I mean, I think for women who are in marriages where maybe it was a good match to begin with, but 20, 30 years later, people do evolve, hopefully. And sometimes they evolve, together in a way that's compatible, and sometimes they evolve in ways that are not compatible. And so I think for people who do not have abuse, addiction, or affair to kind of use as their reason to leave, I think there can be a lot more shame regarding that, and stigma. And oftentimes they'll say, I don't know that I should be leaving. He's not a bad guy. He's never hit me, but I don't feel connected. I don't feel heard. I don't feel like we have anything in common. I don't feel any kind of emotional connection. And in those cases, I think there's just tremendous amounts of guilt. And people can feel certainly guilty leaving somebody who's abusing them too. That's part of the abuse dynamic, is to make the victim feel guilty. But I think there's a certain kind of guilt of leaving a, a marriage where the other person is not a villain.
Interesting.
And oftentimes those people have thought about divorce for a very long time. It's been on their mind for a long time before they're finally able to initiate, because, hoping maybe it will get better, maybe I can do it, maybe it's not quite so bad.
So what's the
And I
tipping
think
point?
giving up hope is like one of the hardest things to do in a marriage, giving up the hope that it's going to get better. Because I think, the biggest majority of marriages are not horrible every single day, right? I mean, there's a small percentage that are horrible every single day, but most marriages are, they might be horrible one day, but then the next day they're okay, and the next day they're good, and the next day they're okay, and the next day they're horrible. But wait, but last week it was good. So, you want to, I mean, I think people want to be really sure before they leave. And it's harder to be sure if it kind of, there's that riding that cycle of it's
So
good sometimes.
what does tend to be the tipping point for these people that you're describing where, he's not a villain, where they've got some good days or, just upsetting days, but they've been feeling unhappy for a long time. But, it sounds like things are pretty much like on the outside stable status quo, right? So I guess like what does tend to be the tipping point for those people?
I think it's different in each and every case. It can be pretty, I haven't seen so many patterns in that way. I think it's different for everybody, except the only pattern that I would say is really the empty nest or retirement. Like spending a lot of time together can be a tipping point. We saw a lot of marriages go through a lot of hard times during the pandemic
Oh
when
yeah.
suddenly everybody was home together. Um,
Right.
so that can be a tipping
Mhm.
point, is spending much more time together.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I've heard that, why, what's going on, and then they'll say like,
Mhm.
oh, he's not working outside the house anymore. Like,
Right,
you
right,
know,
right. Yeah.
yeah, interesting.
My favorite story about spending more time together is I was talking to a guy, older guy. He retired, so he'd worked however many
Mhm.
years he'd worked, 8 hours, 10 hours a day, whatever it was. And so he retired. He was in whatever his room was, his little man cave or whatever it was, living room, whatever. His wife turned on the vacuum cleaner and goes into that room and starts vacuuming and then like banging on his feet. And
Mhm.
so he goes, all right, I get it. You don't want me here at home. And
Oh.
so we had to actually go out and find something to do so that he wasn't with her
Uh-huh.
100% of the time. So I kind of
Yeah.
get that. You're not used to it. She
Right.
wanted, he was still married, by the way. He
Yep.
just
Yep.
realized that he needed to not be,
Yeah.
hanging around her or the
Underfoot.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, underfoot. Yeah, the entire
Yeah.
time. Really,
Yeah.
really kind of
Yeah.
humorous. I have to ask you a couple of questions though. So let me kind of zero in. What drew you to focus your work on women?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I've always I've been a therapist for 30 years, and it's always been part of my work. And I think that women really appreciate having the women's only support groups where they can talk very openly and
Mhm.
honestly with each other, and without worrying that they're gonna say something about their husband that offends a man in the room or something like that. So they've really I really appreciate the ways in which they can be so open and honest and connected in that
Mhm.
work. And I think, you know, as we've been talking about all along, marriage is different and divorce is different for men and women. And I wanted to create a women's space to explore some of that.
Mhm.
So that's really the
So
impetus.
let me ask a question. I want to set it up by telling you a real quick story. Speaking to a woman who wasn't married, she was actively dating. She started dating this guy that had teenage sons. And so she was over at dinner, and the teenage sons were talking about their dating, girls in high school or whatever. She was horrified by the perspective that the young men had about their dating of
Mhm.
women. Just absolutely horrified, because obviously she was a woman. She'd seen the other side of that dating relationship. So when I think about your work with women and divorce, I have to ask you: have you ever worked with a man or with men, and in relation to divorce? And if you have, what were are there any fundamental differences in perspective or in approach or in issues when working with men and divorce and women in divorce?
I haven't really worked with a lot of men. So the
Okay.
few that I have worked with, I don't know that there's enough of a population
Okay.
there for me to tell you the differences. I know I've been in a peer supervision group
Mhm.
with a woman who was running divorce groups that were co-ed. And what she would find in the co-ed groups is that the co-ed groups would be all women, or sometimes there would be all women and one man would show up. And the men were not, again, it's about socialization. I think we
Mhm.
really need to help men have spaces where they can talk in an emotional way and connect with each other. Um, so that they can really talk through their feelings. I think, if you look on Amazon, the divorce books for men are really like they're all about like win your battle, fight to the end of your divorce. It's all about fighting and battles and winning, rather than grieving and understanding and collaborating to be a better co-parent. There's kind of a battle mentality. Now that's just on Amazon, so take that for what it's worth. But I think we really, really need spaces for men to come together and be able to talk openly and honestly and not be labeled as being weak for having feelings or for talking about their feelings. I mean, I think that story about
So,
the teenagers, I think there's two things happening right now in this country, and I think there are a lot of young men who are more modern and more taking into account the gender roles and having a lot of respect for women. And I think there's this whole other very scary, that kind of manosphere thing that's happening online, with young men being pulled into these internet rooms. And I mean, the news in the last few days about these 62 million visitors to that website. I mean, uh, it's so worrisome. It's so worrisome.
sure, absolutely, absolutely. So you've worked with a lot of women. You've either are married or have been married.
Yep.
What's the one thing that you would tell women, or tell a friend if they were if a woman friend, if they were about to get married? What would you tell
If they were about to get married.
them? Yeah,
Is that what yeah, okay.
yeah,
Uh, well, I mean, I have daughters. And one of the things that I tell my daughters is that it takes a long time to get to know somebody and to get to know somebody very well. And we all present our shiniest, best selves in the beginning. But I
of course.
really want people, when they're in a relationship, to get to know, like, what is your partner like when there's an illness? What is your partner like when you have a success, when your partner has a success? What is the relationship like when there's a stressor? Um, and so really taking a lot of time to get to know somebody over time, I think is my best advice for somebody. I mean, I do believe in marriage. I do believe in love. I do believe in long-term relationships. And I believe in them when they're healthy. I don't believe that we should define success by the length of your marriage. I believe we should define success by how happy both of you are, how content both of you are, how respectful your partnership is, not by how you're able to white knuckle it through to get to 60 years, right? Right? So, yeah.
I think that's good advice. Uh, Getting to know, spending the time to get to know them through various and
Yes.
sundry adversities in life makes a lot of
Yes.
sense. I recognize people today tend to get married a little later than they
Yep.
had 40,
Which
50
is
years
which is
ago.
part of the reason that the divorce rate is lower, is because people are waiting longer to get married.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because a lot of a good big complaint or I shouldn't say complaint, but something I hear a lot is just like, I can't even talk to him or I can't talk to her. Like that's like the common thing, when you were saying like, how are they in all these different scenarios, it just
Yeah.
goes back to that
Yeah.
communication of like, they don't feel heard, like for men and women, they don't feel heard. I can't
Yep.
talk to him. I can't talk to her anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a real
I want to be
worrisome.
respectful of everybody's time. I'd like to give each of you a minute or so to summarize. Una, I'm going to give you the last word, which means you'll go second. Erika, if you'd like to summarize the discussion or issues that you see that you'd like to bring up relative to women and divorce, be happy to hear it.
Yes. Well, thank you again today for joining us. This was a very lovely discussion, Una. I think your book is really helpful to just really map it out. Like you said, there is nothing out there like it. And, I know we hit on a lot of points, with communication and all of that, but at the end of the day, divorce is not an indicator of your self-worth, your success. It's nothing to be ashamed about or feel guilty about. And it does get better. It's just a lot of these feelings, it could be very intense, but it's also, temporary, even though it might feel like it's going to be forever. And I know we didn't get to talk a little bit about the language, but I did really love, how, you had talked about the use of language and reframing, your outlook and things like that. So, yeah, thank you.
Oona,
Erika,
what do
yeah,
you
that was such a great summary. I don't really have much to add to that because you did such a fantastic job. But I love, and I do agree, divorce is not a failure. It's a restructuring of a family. It's a life transition. It's not a failure, and it does get better. And and I just want to let people know that my book, which is Unhitched, The Essential Divorce Guide for Women, that it does come in an ebook and paperback and also an audiobook as well. So if you would like to listen instead of read, you can do that.
It is a fabulous book. Like I said before, you provided a lot of tools. You could feel the compassion coming through. So I thought it was an absolutely outstanding book. I'm hoping that this is not your only book, because I know that as in your work, there must be other areas that need to be focused on, and if you focus on them with the same care and consideration that you did with this book, you'll be helping lots of women. So I absolutely encourage you to write your second book.
Thank you.
With that, and then come back for exactly. A second podcast.
Yes.
Exactly. With that, let me say that our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services. It's an insurance-based provider whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer: I am not a medical professional, and I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.